All right, welcome to another episode of the Bookem Nook Show. My name is Kyle Colley, and this is an episode of Author Talks, a podcast about hearing the behind the scenes stories, visions, and writings of different authors. Today, my guest is Britney Lewis. Britney Lewis is an award winning Kansas City author. She is the author of the Undead Truth of Us, The Dark Place, and her newly announced book, Blood Moon. She is an iced coffee enthusiast, a dancer, and an urban hiker. Brittany, welcome to the Author Talks podcast.
Oh my gosh, thank you for inviting me. And that it's always so fun hearing that bio because I'm like, you know what? I really do like iced coffee. That's why I put it in there.
Yeah, and then you're from Kansas City, so go Chiefs for sure.
Oh, go Chiefs for sure. Literally the Super Bowl is tomorrow. So it's getting wild over here in Kansas City. There's lots of Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift talk.
Oh yeah,
Um, so yeah, it's wild.
yeah. I have family from Kansas City, so I grew up a Chiefs fan. So I have to ask this too before we go in.
Yeah.
Do you barbecue? Are you a big barbecue person?
Yeah,
Okay.
okay, so yes, but also I am a vegetarian, so it gets a
Uh,
little tricky these days. But yeah, of
I was
course,
gonna say
barbecue.
Gates are Arthur Bryant's for you.
Gates, we're Gates family over here.
Okay, okay, just making
I it
sure.
used to be turkey on bun for me.
There you
I love
go.
chicken fries.
Sounds good. Let's get into it. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to become a writer and now an author?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I, of course, am from Kansas City, which I love. And I would say growing up, I wasn't the biggest fan of reading books, especially in elementary school. I was, however, encouraged to read whenever Pizza Hut start doing like a free mini pizza for how many ever books you would read. So I would start reading a lot of picture books. But in high school, I dived into the fantasy realm of Twilight, and I was essentially stuck into reading ever since. And that was like kind of what like relit my passion for reading and storytelling. And right when I finished the Twilight Saga, I immediately started writing my own stories at the age of 17. Mostly just because while I loved the lore of the vampires and the werewolves, I wanted a little bit more representation and I wanted to see myself in those stories just a little bit more. So I just started writing my own books and I never stopped then. So I've been writing, I would say, hardcore at least since 2010. And the biggest oomph about me, like being inspired for me becoming a writer, was definitely like the Twilight Saga. So kudos to Stephanie Meyer, but also like just that drive of wanting to see more, a little bit more diversity in stories is what really kicked it off for me.
Yeah, I love how that series has kicked off so many great writers too. Just like people just constantly inspired by her work. And I would love to hear about just as far as when because you started working in
Mhm.
marketing, editing for greeting cards. So I'd love to
Mhm.
hear about your journey becoming an author and talking about some of those diverse topics that you've had and maybe some of your experience how that it has shaped your writing style and your storytelling.
Yeah, that's such a good point. So I went to college. I got my degree in corporate communications with an emphasis in business and art. And I knew that I always wanted to be a storyteller and to write and tell stories, but I wasn't sure if I would be able to do something like that full time. And so to have a backup plan, I got a business degree essentially. And right out of college, I went ahead and I actually started leasing apartments in downtown Kansas City, and that's kind of where I got my foot into the marketing door. So I did have a lot of marketing under my belt when it came to my degree because I had to take marketing classes and I worked in the marketing department. And that's kind of when I started telling like newsworthy stories that we would post on our websites. And I would start doing interviews and I kind of dived a little bit into journalism. But it was after college when I started my degree, or when I started my first job in leasing and marketing. Not my first job, but one of my jobs in leasing and marketing, when I started diving into the world of copywriting and kind of writing like blurbs and stuff. And that really helped me finesse my query letters. And for those who don't know, in traditional publishing, which is the route that I decided to take, you need a query letter to get a literary agent, and you need a literary agent to get a book published. And so doing all of that and kind of being able to get a better grasp on shorter storytelling in a sense, it helped me get my synopsis together in order to send out to literary agents. And that was really, really cool. And then after that, I kind of started doing a lot more corporate communications with the university where I was doing a lot of their branding. And then a little bit later, and what I do now is I actually write greeting cards full time. And so I would say a lot of my experience really has kind of been a melting pot for me when it comes to marketing myself. So you'll always see me on social media. I'm all over TikTok and Instagram. Twitter and or X these days is like kind of here and there, and so is Threads, but that's kind of why I love it so much, is because I'm just so used to doing it all the time. And then as far as like being able to write short copy, it really helped influence my writing because I would say a lot of my stories have like shorter sentences or they're a little bit more punchy when it comes to the plot, just because I'm so used to like getting to that plot really quickly.
No, I love when like I watch some of your social media because for authors sometimes that's a little bit of a challenge. They're like, all right, I got to
Mhm.
write a book and I got to do a lot of this marketing. And
Yeah.
I'm interested to hear how you have been able to balance like social media content while writing books, like just that balance.
It really is tricky balancing everything out. There are some days I will admit where I do feel really overwhelmed because I also have a full-time job. So it feels as if I have two full-time jobs and I also have to do social media. And when it gets really overwhelming, I do tell myself to take a break from that. But generally speaking, the cool thing about that is because I love doing it so much, I have myself down in a routine, right? So I'll say, okay, well, maybe I'll do Instagram on like Tuesdays and Thursdays, and maybe I'll figure out what I want to do on TikTok. When it comes to shooting TikTok videos, they're so short. It's so fast that I can batch out a bunch of content in an hour. So I generally do that. I'll take a day where I'll sit down and just get a lot of content together. And that way throughout the week, I already like know what I'm going to post. And then there are some days where I'm feeling a little bit more adventurous. Well, I'll just have like a spontaneous idea and I'll post that. But for the most part, I stick to a single day where I'm kind of generating all my ideas for social media. And having that day set aside really sets me up for the week or the weeks coming. And then when it comes to writing and getting books together and drafting and or editing, I really do set aside time in the morning. So an hour before I start my workday, I sit down, I have my cup of coffee, and I just start writing and I just have my headphones in. Sometimes I'm listening to music. Sometimes I'm just listening to the sound of rain to kind of like
Okay.
zone my thoughts out, which is really nice. And then I'll just write for an hour, letting myself free draft, which means I don't edit. I don't check for errors. I don't fact check myself at all. I just draft for an hour and get as much done as I can. And then later, when it comes to the editing process, I'll go back through and clean that up. But that's kind of been my routine recently, and I like it. It hasn't always been so detailed and fleshed out. But now that I have book deals, I have to have like a routine for myself. So that's been really, really helpful.
No, that balance that's perfect. And speaking of that, I would love to get into your novel, The Undead Truth of Us, which explores themes such as grief, love, and of course, zombies. What inspired you to dive into these particular combination of themes?
Oh my gosh. Well, I've always loved zombies, and I'll also show the book for those of
Yeah, of
you
course.
watching. So The Undead Truth of Us is my debut novel. I love the story so much. It was the first book that I've ever gotten published. And essentially the idea for this book came from my own like inner dialogue and grief with myself, and also just the grief and the toughness of relationships. So I will say one thing about The Undead Truth of Us, it really does explore love in all avenues. So we're talking about friendship love, romantic love, familial love. And for me, it started with romantic love because I just was sitting and thinking to myself, like, I feel I have a lot of crushes on people. I don't know where those crushes end up going. I mean, crushes really are the sense of their name, right? They crush you and they're meant to crush you if they don't work out. But I felt like it wasn't reciprocal a lot. So I asked myself this question, like, what if romantic relationships were a metaphor for zombies, right? When a lot of the times zombies are going after the core things that make you who you are, that make you a human. So they're going after your brain, where you kind of hold all the great things about yourself. And they go after your heart, where we kind of think is a little bit more emotional, our romantic side of ourselves. And so the Undead Truth of Us really does follow 16-year-old Zari Young, who after her mother's super sudden death, just starts seeing these zombies everywhere. And it isn't until she is forced to live with her auntie, where she's just walking the apartment building one day and she runs into Bo. the next door neighbor, and she ends up seeing him as half zombie, half human. And this brings up the question of maybe if she gets to know him better, she'll get to figure out the mystery of what happened to her mom. And while doing this, she ends up learning that love really can change you, for good or for dead in some senses. And so that's my first novel, The Undead Truth of Us. And I had to go with the zombie aspect because, of course, zombies have a really big play on humanity and how we see ourselves and how we see monsters. But also, I've always loved zombie lore. Like, the what was the movie? The Walking Dead TV show like really hooked me in. But then also Dawn of the Dead was one of the first big zombie movies that I loved growing up. And so that's kind of like my ode to them.
War Wars, these two. That was good.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
good.
so good. And then when it comes to character, because you're talking about writing and some of that, like how'd you
Mhm.
dive into some of these characters and which ones were harder to write or which ones spoke to you easier, I guess. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, all my characters come to me and speak to me in different ways, and some of them are harder to tune into. I like to think of characters and listening to them in my head as like a tuning into like a radio signal where you're kind of like trying to find the right dial to get all the static out, and sometimes there's just too much static to hear the story clearly. So I will say with my second book, The Dark Place, it was a little bit harder to fine tune that character's voice for me just because there was so much static around me. But for my first book, The Undead Truth of Us, the main character Zari came to me so easily. She was always kind of just there, and it was easy to write her character because we had a lot of things in common, right? My main character Zari, she is a dancer, and so am I. She dances a form of dance called West Coast Swing, which kind of comes from like the ballroom types of dances. And I have a deep love for West Coast Swing. I've been dancing it for almost 10 years now. And so it was super easy to know that like this is something that she does. This is something that her mother did. And so it was kind of like a familial thing for them. And Zari was also on a journey of finding herself, which I kind of find myself always on a journey of finding myself because we're always growing and we're always changing. And so I love coming of age stories. And all my books that I write have a coming of age story in them because I feel like they hold so much justice. And they're also very like satisfactory for me. It's a good satisfying read when you can read a character and see their journey from start to ending. So that is kind of how I got Zari's character for my second book. Um, the main character's name is Hailey, and she's definitely a little bit more alternative. She's a little bit more angrier with the world, and she has a morally gray way of thinking and being. She's sometimes a lie. Sometimes she's a liar. She's not always the bestest friend. And I feel I was able to really dive into that character because at one point in my life, I felt like I was that person. So it was easy to kind of find who she was because of that. So that's kind of how I get my characters. And then all my secondary characters come to me so easily. Their personalities are always just like so loud. Like in my very first book, The Undead Truth of Us, there's a side character. His name is Jesus, and he's just so funny and he's so goofy. And he reminds me of every class clown I've ever known growing up. And it was just easy tapping into that. The love interests in my stories are always a little bit harder because I'm really trying to like figure them out. And I've always felt like having a love interest in real life, they're always harder to tap into because you don't know them. And they're always mystifying, which makes the lore of them so much more appealing. So those are a little bit trickier, but they always end up panning out somehow in the end.
Yeah, I wanted the reason I asked, like, I wanted you to get into some of the characters and the way you tell these themes and these stories because you talked a little bit about like diversifying your story, your bookshelves, and so many times
Hmm.
people are like, oh, I
Yes.
can't relate to this character or that character based on race or anything, right? But you've talked about themes that are very human themes, right? Whether it's love, whether it's grief. So I'd love for you just to kind of talk about that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I one thing that diversifying ourselves is so important, and I really want to debunk the idea that someone cannot relate to a Black character because at the end of the day, we are all human. And I think some people struggle with sometimes reading diversely because the life experience can be different. But my argument is as long as you care for the character, then you're already hooked into the story. And caring for the character really does come down to common themes, right? Like you said, grief is a common theme. We all experience it but we all experience grief so differently. And so sometimes you might pick up a book and say, like, oh, I really felt that. I really felt that person's grief because I've experienced that form before. And sometimes you can't relate, but you can also sympathize with that person. And I think that's what makes one, you human, but then it also makes the character so much more meatier, right? Like you can really like chew into them and really follow them along as they kind of figure out what's going on in their life. Also, when it comes to stories and like diversifying our shelves, it's not always about the character. Sometimes it's about the plot. Like, can I follow this story along? Am I
Yeah.
interested? You know, one reason why I love fantasy stories and I also love thrillers is because you're so hooked into what's going to happen next. Like, there's this theme of, I don't know what's happening and I can't wait to find out. And that's what keeps you like flipping those pages. And so I do find it frustrating sometimes when people don't pick up stories with Black characters or, Indonesians or Hispanic or whatever part of diaspora you are a part of. I find it frustrating when they can't pick up those stories because they feel there's this fear that they can't relate or there's this fear that they're being preached to when really not every story is that way. Now, every book is different. It's going to do something different for each person, but there's so many books, and that's one cool thing about the world. And now, thankfully, I would say traditional publishing is starting to diversify a little bit more. We are starting to get a lot more stories from diverse voices, and all of our stories aren't the same. We don't all have the same journeys. Some of our characters might share similar identities, but they're different people being told by different people. And I feel like all of those voices are valid.
No, yeah, speaking of like traditional publishing, they have been able
Hmm.
to push some more of these like Black authors and all
Hmm.
types of authors.
Hmm.
I would love to hear just how your journey has been going through traditional publishing for your books.
Yeah, so traditional publishing, I would say, was always my dream. And I think it was my dream because it was the only one that I knew so much about at such a young age. When I finished the Twilight Saga, I started becoming really obsessive with how people got their books published. I couldn't stop reading stories or listening to them. And I actually started running my own blog for the longest time about how did they get book deals? How does it happen for them? Like, what are their stories? And learning about their stories and how they became authors and like what it was they needed to do was what really inspired me and kept pushing me forward into that route. And so when it came to traditional publishing, I knew that I was going to start that journey right after I finished writing my very first book. So I finished my first book in about 2012, and I started querying the exact same time as I was starting to go into college. And it was when I started sending query letters out and starting to get a bunch of rejections when I realized that this was going to be way harder than I thought. Those inspiration stories were helpful, but no one prepares you for how long the journey could be. And so I was querying and looking for a literary agent to represent me for years. Like I always talk about how I was in the query trenches for a decade, just about, which is a long time to be waiting, especially if you have a lot of stories to tell. But every time I got rejected, it really did push me towards writing another story and being better and trying to really perfect my craft. And I don't think that I am a perfect writer by any means necessary, but I do think that I've grown a lot over the years, which has really helped me land the literary agent that I got today. And so essentially in 2018, I ended up landing my first literary agent by doing a Twitter pitch contest on, well, Twitter, what was Twitter, I guess, back in the day. And me and that agent, we were together for about a little over a year. We went on submission and we ended up just parting ways amicably. And then in 2020, or in 2019, I actually got the idea for the Undead Truth of Us. I wrote that book and then I actually started querying for it. And I got my now literary agent, Caitlin, who is an amazing woman. She's literally a powerhouse. And I got her in 2020. We worked on the Undead Truth of Us and then we sold it off to Disney in the fall of 2020. And that was actually a really quick process for me. So it was a very much like a long wait, right? So 10 years of kind of like waiting, or it was more like 8 years of waiting and then 10 years of waiting for my first book, or 2 extra years waiting for my first book to come out. But essentially, it was a lot of waiting. And then all of a sudden, I got my agent, we were editing, and then we sent it out into the world. And I kid you not, like almost 3 to 4 weeks later, we had our first real interest in an offer from Disney. And that was the quickest thing to ever happen to me. And it's very much been a whirlwind experience since then. And I've very much enjoyed I very much enjoyed my relationship with Disney. My editor there at the time was just incredible. And she really saw the vision for both of my books that I had. And she really helped me craft those ideas to become even better ideas. And it was a great time. My second submission experience was totally different, but also still very fun and exciting. And I'm excited for my next fantasy romance series to be coming out next year. But yeah, so far traditional publishing has been fun. I would say the hardest thing about traditional publishing is a lot of the times as an author, because these industries are full of people who love books, right? They love reading. They want to support the industry. They want to support authors, but a lot of the times people are just being overworked and underpaid, and so that means that a lot of work, especially when it comes to marketing and publicity, really does fall on the shoulders of authors sometimes, and that can be a little overwhelming. And I don't think a lot of people expect that because you are with a house, a publishing house that is supposed to ideally be doing all this push, but there's so many levels in traditional publishing that can be really, really hard to navigate through, especially when you're new to the industry.
Yeah, thank you, Brittany, just for just demystifying. Because with authors, it's like, all right, I wrote the book, and then you're just like, all right, now I got to go and, like you said, quick query, and then figure out who to find a publisher, and then find the author, and then you got to market it. So it's all of these things. So when I talk to authors, I see so many parallels, and even to like being a music artist or even a
Yes.
entrepreneur, where it's like there's so many no's, right? And you have to be able to
Mhm.
use those no's to leverage you and sometimes take the criticism, but also being an artist, knowing that sometimes what you want to put out into the world is like what's most personal to you. So when you say it affects the most amount of people. So speaking of that, I would love for you to talk about your second release, the Dark Place, which you got a little bit more sci-fi, some horror, some mystery. Can
Yeah.
you talk about the inspiration behind this book as well?
Absolutely. The Dark Place is my sophomore novel, the second novel. So I have such an interesting relationship with this book, but this book I do love. I love the cover too. So if you're watching, I'm just holding up a book, my actual book, The Dark Place. I'm so silly. Okay, so The Dark Place is a story of Hailey, and it follows 17-year-old Hailey, who mysteriously just disappears one day. She's living her life and she just ups and she disappears. And she ends up landing in an alternate version of reality that looks very similar to our reality, except that things are distorted, it's darker, and she ends up realizing that the people there look a little different. The mystery, though, is that she realizes that she lands on the same day in the past when her brother went missing about 8 years ago. And he hasn't been found since then. And so her whole thing is if she can figure out how to get back to the past, maybe she can bring her brother back and or figure out where it was that he went. So this happens to her, and it happens actually in front of her family. And when she ends up returning back to our present day reality, her family is kind of spooked. I say her family, but her parents specifically are the ones that witnessed this. And her family thinks the best thing for her is to send her off to live with her grandmother off in the suburbs. So she ends up living with her grandmother and going to a new school. And it's a bigger, different experience for her because she's from the inner city. And so she ends up going to the suburban high school where she ends up meeting this kid named Elam. And Elam actually ends up knowing a whole lot about time travel. He's such a nerd. We love that for him. He also works at a coffee shop. I feel he's like this very cool guy that is just really nerdy and loves like all things Marvel, all things that you can get into that involves like using your brain in a way that you wouldn't normally think, like quantum physics, for
Yeah, of
example.
course.
What even is that? And he together they kind of get together and try to solve this mystery of what happened to her brother, but also what's happening to her. So that is The Dark Place. I like to kind of compare it to Coraline meets Stranger Things, just because you really do have that other world from Coraline, but also you have all of these other parts of relationships intertwining between that. And it really does play on themes of grief and romance and also like family secrets as well.
Yeah. So, what inspired some of the time travel and some of the alternative realities? Where'd you think like, okay, I need to incorporate this, or what sparked some of those ideas?
Yeah, actually, I would say for the time travel aspect, I one of my very favorite books and movies has always been The Time Traveler's Wife. But
Okay.
it changed for me when I read the book, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, I love this story. This is so cool." And then around the same time, I also saw a movie called About Time, which is about the story of this guy who ends up time traveling by going through like doors. It's just so neat. And so he could go to the future or to the past, and I just was sitting on all of this thinking, how can I use that in my like stories one day? And then I was able to kind of come up with the dark place, but a darker level, hence the title, right? Where what if you could change the future or you could change the past, but when trying to do that, what if you end up in an alternate version of reality? And I wanted to really play with how sometimes our grief takes us into what looks like an alternate version of reality, right? It's just a metaphor for grief, and that sometimes your world it doesn't look the same, and it's hard to convey to someone else how you're experiencing the loss of someone that you love, um when you don't always have the words to say that. And for me, I just used time travel and an alternate dimension, and that was really, it was so much easier to talk about quantum physics, right, than talk about emotionally how that person's feeling.
No, that's good. Also, how do you deal with book criticism or like negative reviews? Do you read them? Do you not? Do you just you kind of go about your day regardless, or how do
Oh my
you
gosh.
balance those things?
Yeah, I definitely go about my day regardless. But so I will admit with my first book, like when you're waiting for so long, so just for those listening, with traditional publishing, on average, it takes about 2 years for your first book to come out. So the book gets purchased, and then there's a couple years of editing, and then it goes through all these different phases before it hits shelves. And I had so much time waiting for the Undead of Us to come out that I felt a little obsessive about like making sure that my book was getting to readers, or I felt a little obsessive with making sure I was on social media. And sometimes I would like go and check Goodreads, you know. But I told myself like there's a hard dead stop once the book comes out, because people get way more access to the book. People are going to start leaving way more reviews. And at that point, I'm not going to read a negative review because it's just going to put me in a headspace that isn't going to really help me at that point. You know what I mean? So I
Yeah.
can't really dwell on something I can't change with something that's already published. And I like to say that, like, once that book is out in the world, it's no longer mine, it's the reader's stories. And readers leave reviewers for other reviewers. And at that point, I'm not really a reviewer anymore because I wrote the story. I'm just this kind of like weird entity floating above those reviews. So I just keep myself out of them. I just truly believe that like I don't want to invade on those spaces. And in the times where I've been tagged in a negative review on social media, I try to just turn it off, like untag myself or like
Yeah.
try to block it so that I don't see it, just because I know that sometimes it can really filter the way that I think about myself and filter the way that I tell stories. So I try to stay away from negative reviews, and the positive ones are always really enlightening. I will say there has been times where like I feel down in the dumps where if I'm gonna go on Goodreads, I will just filter it to 5-star reviews, you know, and just be like, oh, that's such a nice thing to say. So
I
just like going in with blindness.
Sure. No, I think that's great. That's great advice. How have you evolved as a writer? Or how has your literary taste changed from book one to book two, and then even now that you're even about to release the next one as well, that maybe we can talk about. I'm not sure how much.
Yeah, yeah, we can. Totally
Okay,
can.
perfect.
So I love that question. I think my writing style has changed definitely like a lot. And not in like as big as a change that maybe readers would find on page, but I would say a lot of that is due to just me reading more books and finding more books that I love reading. Like I really love reading a literary story that also is intertwined with like a fantasy element. So one of my favorite authors right now in the adult space is Alexis Henderson. She's a Black author. She wrote The Year of the Witching, and she also wrote darn, I'm forgetting her second book, but it involves vampires and blood maids, which was just so much fun. But I love her writing style. It's very dark and ethereal, and it's very moving in a way that like doesn't do too much. She's not overly flowery, but she is at sometimes, and I just love that so much. I also one of my favorite books is Wilder Girls by Rory Power. That's a young adult that's a young adult story, which is kind of sci-fi a little bit, and that these girls end up stuck, at an all-girls school in the woods. And the way that Rory really tells that story was just so beautiful to me, and it was also very strange. And I love that about writing. I love strange writing that feels disconnected, but like pulls the story together in a way that gives you goosebumps. I even have goosebumps talking about it. Like I think in the Wilder Girls, the first page, even like the first sentence was like something out there somewhere. It just like it sets you up for this story where you're like unsure of what's happening. And that's my favorite thing ever. So I would say that like a lot of these stories and these books have influenced my own writing. And it's pushed me to be a little bit more creative when it comes to sentence structure and dialogue and the way that we look at the world. I like to really dive into every sense that we have as far as our five senses go. Um, when it comes to storytelling. So I tell myself, okay, so like if I'm in this moment, what can I hear? What can I feel? What can I smell? What can I taste? And I know I listed off a couple of those, but those really help me put myself in that moment a lot better. And it really helps me visualize the story really good, really well too. So I feel like it's just changed over time because I've been writing so much more that I've been able to kind of like really tackle into that style of writing that I wanted to be at so much quicker. And so when I'm fast drafting, I find myself doing that way more often now.
Yeah, and what I like about your books, they're like two different stories, right? Like sometimes sometimes it feels like the author kind of writes like they're in a different genre, it still feels like this is it's kind of just a different story that like allows
Mhm.
you to have these two things. So I want to kind of know like so when like say for like an artist, like a music artist, they have to go
Mhm.
get a lot of world experience before they make that next album.
Yes.
As authors, I think you have to do that as well too, but you're also on such a time crunch. I want to know like how do you continue to get these new life experiences and still be on that time crunch and have to like put a new book out, whether it's like every year or every other year? How does that work for you?
Yeah. Oh man, it's such a good question because it really can feel nitty-gritty sometimes. I think for me, one thing I've done that's been really helpful is I just stay moving and consistent, like really consistent with like reading books, um, with using like an audiobook. That's helped me so much because even if I cannot physically read a story, which is my favorite way to read a story because I love looking at the words, right? I just like I just I love it so much. It's a weird thing that I have, but it slows me down when it comes to physically reading books because I find myself reading a sentence over and over and over again, and I start like dissecting like why I like that sentence, and it just distracts me from finishing the book. So I listen to a lot of audiobooks and I do that while I'm walking because I have to because I'm listening to it, but I'm also getting the story in, and that helps keeps me like creatively fed. So it helps me feel like I'm always in the state of listening to a story and writing a story. And they really do go hand in hand for me when it comes to my own creative purposes. But I also am diving into other creative outlets, right? Like I dance once or twice a week, and that really helps me get creative in different ways. And it really brings in like how I can tell a story from a different perspective. For example, my first book, The Undead Truth of Us, the main character who also is a dancer, I could tap into her in such a different way and what some of her like mannerisms would be because she's a dancer, right? Like maybe she's practicing a step or maybe she's counting out the rhythms of the beat, right? She like knows how to track time in her head because she's so used to tracking time in music. And so being able to like use that creative outlet somewhere else is really helpful. I used to also like draw and paint a lot, and that would visually help me see the world because I know how to like put it together. My grandmother or my nana, I would call her, she's an artist, and she would always tell me, art's not hard. It's just different shapes put together. Like if you can draw a circle, you can draw a person. And I used to think, man, that's so cool. You are so smart. So I started to think of like a book that way, and I started to think of like taking something so big and so mundane and making it a little bit more mundane in that it's just these small pieces coming together to make a big thing.
Yeah, that's a great. I love that answer. As we kind of wrap up, yeah, I don't have much to say there. As we kind of wrap up, I want to hear, like, curious about what's next for you. I know you just announced Blood Moon, so maybe you give us a premise of it or anything that you want to share to our audience.
Absolutely. So I am so obsessed with this story in this feature series. It is called Blood Moon. Blood Moon is the first book in a fantasy romance series that follows 18-year-old Mira, who is mysteriously accepted into a university in a town that's known for its legends for werewolves and vampires. And she ends up getting to campus and she quickly learns that those legends are actually true. And she finds herself in this very strange enemies to lovers romance with one while also being in the midst and the key to an ancient magical war that's been going on for centuries, except that she's just now learning about it. So it's a really cool thing. I mostly obsessed because there's werewolves and I love the werewolves from Twilight. So I like to pitch this book as New Moon meets Legendborn because they're so similar. And if you really could put those books together, you would get the Blood Moon series that I have. And I'm just really pumped about it. It comes out next year with Page Street, which is an imprint of Macmillan. And I can't wait till we can even share the cover. And I can't wait until we can get this into the hands of early readers. I think it's going to be a really exciting time. And I'm just really pumped. Like I've never done like high stakes fantasy before. I've always done more horror, a bit slower contemporary stories. And this one is just full of so many tropes that I love. I just am really excited for readers to get their hands on this one.
Yeah, congratulations on that. And again, I'm just saying I admire that you continue to push yourself as an author and continue to go into those different lanes and genres and stories. So thank you so much again, Britney, for being on the podcast. Please let us know where to find you on the internet, as well as make sure to get your books. So I'll put them in the links in the show link below.
Absolutely. Well, and I appreciate you having me on here. You can definitely find me and all my things at BritneySLewis.com. But you can also follow me on social media. You can follow me on TikTok at Britney S. Lewis. You can follow me also on Instagram at the same handle. And all my books are also linked on my website. So you can find those too. And it's just please add Blood Moon to your TBR list on Goodreads.
Perfect. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you again.
Thanks. You do the same.